I just finished doing a remote video consultation with a lovely person named Eric in central Iowa, Zone 5B, so a cool area in central United States, northern. And we talked for about an hour or so about food forest designs, thinking through strategies of protecting the boundaries of his property, his family's property, from spray drift from an agricultural farm nearby, thinking through strategies around adding more trees around a declining white ash stand, and a remote site that he has where we're thinking about co-planting with black walnuts and in wet areas. So we recorded that session and I'll share it with you now. If any of that is of value, feel free to stick through it. If you have suggestions for him, feel free to drop some comments in there and let us know what sort of questions you might have, and we'll keep having dialogue. We plan to record more of these over time and share them with the community when folks are into it, so stick around. So we've got these two separate properties. We've got your main home, long north-south property here with a huge amount planted. And boy, it's neat. I've got to pick your brain at some point. The way you made these maps seems really nice and organized, that you can go through
Yeah,
and see. Yeah.
I think that's more for myself than anything, just to remember.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, I don't compared to you, I don't have a tremendous amount planted, but I try to do um, as much as I can every year, and it just gives me a reference of when I planted, what happened, what was the result.
Yeah.
If I have some damage from animals, or if I lose the plant, if it just doesn't grow straight out of the gate, then I know that, and I can reference those markings.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just simply a Google map that you can edit.
Yeah, that's great. And the level of resolution is close enough. Like, I guess if you had plants, 2 feet apart or 3 feet apart, it would
Right.
start to get tough. But for an orchard layout, for grafted varietals, and when I see like, okay, this crab apple planted 1016, that's pretty darn neat.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, okay, so that's that property, and then you've got some markers for property boundary, and there's some yellow boxes in here as well that somehow won't let me click on them. But
Um, Most of those are just like flower beds
I see.
that we've added since we bought the property.
Cool. That's
Um,
it's a nice way to use existing free software out there, and the fact that I can look at it too, and you tell me which plant to look at. I know exactly where I'm going
right.
with that, so
Yeah.
that's helpful.
Nice to be able to share.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so I see that, and then I see the other property, which is more or less a blank slate with
Right.
the willows and the elderberries in the northeast corner.
And I
Uh,
didn't extend that down, Sean. It kind of goes down to the southern tree line there as well. So I did a whole line,
I see. Okay.
north to south. I just didn't extend it. I just wanted to do, for representation for myself, I wanted to show that pattern, kind of the order that I did, so I could remember what was what.
Okay.
Um, you can see there um, to the right on the map. You can see that's kind of where some of the camping area is. I just wanted to kind of make a visual screen, similar to your living wall.
Right. So I see. So there's neighbors to the east of this open
Correct.
spot that,
Yep.
yeah, there you go. And so then they get to look in and see really beautiful various willows and elderberry, and you get to look at
Right.
elderberry and willows and maybe hear a campfire on the other side of it. But
Right.
um,
Exactly.
great. And then it's nice too, since that's a remote site, there's some real value. I'm guessing you've already thought of this, but the fact that, now on site, as you start to build more and more plant material, you can just simply make copies of those as
Yes.
needed. Like you've got your own reserve right there.
Yeah, and that's kind of one thing. You and I had uh, spoke just a bit ago about. There's a lot of deer pressure in that area,
Mm-hmm.
and in fact, talking to some of the neighbors they spend a lot of time in their camper there. I was speaking to them, and they were just wondering how I was going to keep those plants alive with all of the deer. Well,
Mm-hmm.
I think my plan, and something you talk about a lot, is just to plant a lot, and kind of share that space with them, as much as possible. Hopefully, they don't browse it all the way down. I can get some plant growth up, and to be able to clone some of those and to continue planting.
Yeah, so an additional layer, of course you could, in seeing, when I look at this remote property and I see that so far all of your planting efforts are focused in one very, very specific area, it is not a huge lift to say, what does it look like to hammer in some stakes around that, or some T-posts, and either put up a fence or put up, the lower hanging fruit would be a 30-pound monofilament fishing line. Do a couple rings of that at 18 and 36 inches. Basically, just have like a deflective boundary. Lower embodied energy yet, but still a nod towards protection. And maybe you've already thought of this, is I do see lots of shrubs and trees around there. So if there's other thinning, or if there's deadfall or shattered branches, laying some like good branch complexity, maybe some brambles and canes, just detritus and debris all around there might keep them physically out from browsing in the first place.
Okay.
Year one, year two, they're just getting started. That's when there's fragility there, and if they are starting to get browsed and there is no intervention, they could get hammered back enough that they don't have a chance to get. Once you've got copies all over the place and planting 200 cuttings a year and it costs you nothing, then like who cares? But for now, a little protection might go along. Not to put up electric, not to put up an orchard, metal fencing, but what does it look like to start with branches? If that doesn't work, hammer in some posts with some fishing line, and if that doesn't work, then maybe you need to be planting way more. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it might end up being a combination of things there.
Yeah, and knowing that there are plants, you get towards your blackberries and black cap raspberries, your gooseberries and black currants. Some of those, for the most part, are nearly deer proof without any sort of fencing, and may actually confer fence. So part of your living wall could be that you plant in gooseberries or you plant in blackberries around the boundary of that, and they over time help add more layers of fencing for those plants.
Sure.
So with that,
I'm
sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, we were just speaking of plants that have deer resistance. Do you have any experience with any Goumi at all, or is propagating them?
Yeah.
Are they easy to do as far as
propagation-wise, yeah, so let's see. I've been able to propagate Goumi from cuttings, but not at great results. And I've heard from other folks that similar pattern. There are some people that just seem magically to be able to get those plants to root all the time. Goumi hardwood cuttings with bottom heat. So if you take them, let's say sometime in March, you put them in a good light, well-drained media, and you prioritize that what you're looking for are slightly fatter wood, like you're looking for something roughly in the Sharpie diameter, 3/8 inch or larger, nice and long. So with bottom heat, good thick wood in March, I can generally get callousing and some rooting on 30%, 50%. And then then you would need to put them in a nursery bed for a season, and then they're beautiful. They're like 3-foot tall, beautiful plants. And this is pretty much exactly the same as what I found with autumn olive, which makes sense because they're so similar. Stooling, yes, they will root with stooling, but they are very sluggish. It's about a year or two of a really well done, very explicit stool. So you might even want to put like a ring, either cut out a 5-gallon bucket, or some sort of ring of plastic that can be slit and put around the plant, and so then your stooling material stays put. It doesn't slough off as easily. And if you do that, I think within a year or so of like good sawdust, moist composty stuff, you'd get some decent rooting from that. And they're decent from seed, but the seed seems to be obligate to not really dry out. So it's like you want to harvest, enjoy the fruit, and get the seed immediately in nursery beds with a good tag, good fluffy soil, mulch them in the fall, and then next spring, once in a while when the timing works out, I get like 80% germination. So from a good plant, you might get, 500 fruits. So then you're off and running. Yeah. So try all, yeah.
Yeah, one of my plants now is really starting to produce, which has been nice, and I've been enjoying the fruit. But yeah, I hadn't tried propagating it yet, so I just thought I'd pick the brain on that one because that does seem to be a bit more deer resistant than some of my other plants.
I still truly can't get my head around both autumn olive and Goumi thus far seem nearly 100% uninteresting to deer. The
Mm-hmm.
young wood can get browsed pretty hard by rabbits, but once they're, if you protect them a little, year 1, year 2, then once they've got good woody trunks, they are just left alone. And they're amazing nitrogen fixers. The leaves are gorgeous, like beautiful trellis to grow plants on. They're just so used, and like a Goumi, I mean, it's a straight up gummy bear. Like, what the heck?
Yeah, they're good.
They're
Yeah.
so good. Um, yeah. So yeah, and so let me pop over. I'm guessing the Goumis are planted around your home site.
Right, they're over in the orchard there.
Oh, you've got honeyberries. This is great. A nice diverse planting. Um, yeah, sweet scarlet, Goumi. Right. So you've got named cultivars. That's awesome. If you can get a hold of carmine, so you've got the two, sweet scarlet and red gem are both lovely. If you can track down carmine,
Okay.
highly recommended. The fruit, it's the largest of the fruits that I've ever seen.
Okay.
And yeah, and autumn olive, I know, it's like a lot of mixed reviews that people have or mixed feelings on them, but there's a nursery called plantingjustice.org.
Okay.
Plantingjustice.org. They've got named varietals of Goumi, and the named cultivars available of autumn olive are just stupefyingly good. Like
Really?
Charlie's Golden, Amber, Punch Bowl. There's like 15 different named varieties,
Wow.
and yeah, all the same basic things. If you can plant them at the remote site, and the nice thing then is you've got Goumi, which crops mid-season. That's awesome. And then autumn olive, you've got like 8 varieties, all of which have their own cropping timing. You might be able to have big orange goobery fruits until late November.
Right.
So then it's like 3 months out of the summer, you're eating something like a Goumi or an autumn olive.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the goal, is to kind of spread it out, at least here.
Mm-hmm.
Though the other farm is probably just a bit more for wildlife and visual protection and things like that for now. Eventually, we may build a little cabin or something up there to enjoy.
Yeah. And you said that property is 30 minutes away. And how frequently do you visit that land?
Um, Lately, more often, just because I've been going up and I planted the plants that I received from you, the cuttings that I received from you this fall. Um, but then just kind of going up and visualizing what I want the space to look like in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of as we look at it at that map, you can see along the river or along the road, between the road and the river, there's a line of trees, and most of those are walnuts. So
Wow.
I'm gonna have to, obviously that's very nice, but it presents a bit of a challenge too as far as what can be planted. I know you've done some of that in your videos, talking about what plants are compatible with black walnut.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, it's a pretty blank slate. I don't know how much I'll be able to plant on the river, which is kind of river bottom, which frequently floods.
Mm-hmm.
So that could be underwater at periods in the typically in the spring, but it can get underwater. So I wouldn't want to put a nursery down there necessarily.
Right.
But the top part would not flood, and that's right now has been set aside, or like CRP, for years. So it's getting a bit grown up. When this map was taken, the neighbor had mowed it, so it does look like a nice mowed hayfield. But now it's a bit more wild. A little.
That's great.
There's some trees and stuff starting to grow up in it. So it was my grandparents' property, and then my mom, and now it's mine. So now I'm taking over some of the management that hasn't been done for forever.
Yeah.
Years.
Yeah. So, when I zoom out here, I see overall it looks like lots of moisture, lots of fertility. The farm fields that are nearby are clearly, they pretty much require drainage tile, I would suspect, because
Right.
the amount, like it's probably whether they like it or not. It's kind of beautiful from the satellite imagery how these farms are laid out, where it's like clear where there's seasonal water that they
Yes.
just simply can't till in there, even if they want to. It looks like these gorgeous. It looks like gorgeous paintings, but it's probably just
Yeah.
frustrated farmers. But
Well, and it's hard to tell. You can't tell the topography from this picture, but a lot of it's pretty hilly or
hmm
bluffy in that area, just being on the river.
yeah,
Um, so a lot of that is just ground that farmers couldn't farm if they wanted to,
right.
which I'm sure, like you said, is frustrating to them. But it's amazing that they can't.
Right. Yeah.
That some of those timber areas are preserved.
Well, so looking at that property a little more, some things that come to my mind is it's compelling slash exciting to have the Black Walnut as an existing overstory. That's just it's great to have trees already for all the good reasons, but then you also have, yes, it's Black Walnut, so it's a very juglone context, but inter periodic flooding with all the excess fertility that comes with that. Your mulberries and your pawpaws, your pecans, those your zone 5B, maybe 6A,
Correct.
somewhere in there.
Yeah, 5B.
Okay, but you haven't seen 5B. You haven't seen -25 in the last decade, I would guess, right?
A couple of years ago, we had a really really cold. Um, we may have, but yeah, it's like you said, it's getting to be where we're not seeing that 5B temperature.
Yeah. So pawpaws in particular yell out to me as like just very much no-brainer. Like you're talking about supporting wildlife. Pawpaws are amazing to feed deer and squirrels in the fall. They are also very good at not being interesting to deer for browse. Rabbits don't seem to browse them. Once they love the black walnut, and then once they're established a bit, they seem to really love a good periodic flood and all the deposition. The catch would be, if you did commit to putting some in, is you'd want to have a strategy for protecting them from spring floods as far as just getting washed out, like before they had their roots in. But there's
Right.
so many branches around. I'm sure you could make with like a pile of big rocks and branches some nice like dams to help catch nutrient upslope of them and take some of the water pressure away from them. Um,
Sure.
but mulberries could tuck in there pretty easily, and other juglans and carria, so like your hickories and your pecans, could all be wherever there's nice light glades in that area. Um, and that the black caps, like there's just so many. It's just wonderful to know that when you've got black walnut to begin with, you don't have 1,000 different plants you can put in, but there's 15 or 20 amazing ones
Right.
that will all work. Um, Sometimes having a smaller palette to choose from can help actually make it more possible to make decisions.
Right. Well, and just given the space, easier to clone, plants too.
hmm
When you have a set plan of what you'd want to do, it's easier to take those cuttings and to go rather than just have a whole bunch.
hmm Yeah. Well, so I want to make sure I'm not. I don't want to drag us along to different areas that you might not want to be talking about. So,
No, that's perfect.
okay, maybe I take a pause here and ask you, like, so what in the time that we're spending together, what are some key things you wanted to make sure we have time to chat about?
Um, I think as far as if you want to go back to the home property map,
Yep.
you'll see that I have about 3.5 acres there of what's alfalfa right now or oats. Um,
That's the lawn looking context.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and we're not married to that at all.
hmm
When we bought the property, it was established. It looks pretty, and the neighbors rent it for a minimal amount of money. So we're definitely not married to keeping it that.
hmm
Um, if you look kind of where the little bit of timber that we have jets out into that,
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind squaring that off and making the north part of that hayfield just plantings, just trees and shrubs and things like that,
Okay.
and even extending that for a little bit further south as well, and just kind of squaring that off, and then having the field be closer to the house, be some switchgrass or some native grasses. So hopefully that can add to the diversity for the animals that live in the area.
Mm-hmm.
As you can see in our area, it's pretty agricultural.
Right.
And as much as I hate it, most of the farmers, they won't leave a lot of the plant material once it's dead, or if it grows up in their fence line. They'll definitely be bulldozing that out and getting new fencing in.
Right.
So they're not leaving a lot of that habitat. And my property isn't huge, but I would like to, as much as I can, just kind of add plant material for my kids, for the future, for whoever's going to have this property after me.
Yeah.
As far as just adding to that for nature, for wildlife.
Right. Yeah, that's the thing. It's a lovely sentiment, the idea of adding for nature, for wildlife. And I always internally like to make sure, and I like to say it out loud, that it's helpful when we consider ourselves wildlife too. And then you're just planting for everybody, for your children and for other people, the deer people's children and the squirrel people's children.
Right. Absolutely.
So a couple first things that come to mind. The one question would be, so the 3+ some odd acres of of the alfalfa that's planted, are they spraying that at all to keep that to the plant?
They don't.
Okay.
The only thing they have done, and this was probably a year ago, they just fertilized it. It was losing a bit of its, nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
So they fertilized it. But beyond that, they don't. So it has, I'm sure they don't love this, but it has gotten grassy.
Mm-hmm.
In the last few years, it has gotten some other plants that have grown up in it, which I don't mind. But I'm sure that they don't love it.
The relationship that you have with the farmer who's accessing the space, is it one where you feel like you really want to preserve that, or it's a good, healthy relationship, or is it something that's like okay?
Yeah, it's fine. It was who rented it when we bought the property, so I just continued to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I have no qualms in saying we're done with renting it to you, though.
Yeah.
And it's not like it's a huge loss to them. They might get 11 or 12 large bales off it a year, depending on moisture.
Right.
So it's not like they're a huge loss, but this is kind of what they do in the area. They have people that have a decent sized little property that aren't farmers themselves,
mm-hmm.
and they'll go in and farm that. But I do know some other people that did that in the past, and then they just told them, no, we're good. We're going to plant that in something else.
Yeah, I think that's because what I can feel is there's a it's out of respect, and it's out of the legacy of what's what the relationship has been. But the planting patterns that you've created in the landscape have a deference to that field, and that's understandable because it's maintained a certain way. It certainly makes sense that, especially right around your home, and we should talk about this, to strategize and think through what it looks like to really start focusing on I think an appropriate word, the defense against the hugeness of the field to the south and east of you.
Right.
To my mind, that's a massive element that would need to be thought about.
Right.
And then concurrently, what it looks like as you get better at propagating your elders and your grapes and all these different mother plants that you've established in the landscape, how to start occupying more and more of that field. So your suggestion around in the northwest corner to have them stop there and start planting that out, that makes sense. I think at the same time, maybe next year you say, what does it look like for you to take 1 less or 2 less passes on the southernmost part of that alfalfa field, and have you be ready to expand out into that with more, if your budget allows, that maybe you're investing $500 or so in some more grafted trees, or getting lots more trees by getting cuttings and seeds. You've got gardens now and more and more skills around propagation that you can be. It just to me like there's a huge amount of potential future orchard there. And the fact that it's in alfalfa and grasses, if you've got trees that are of decent size, if they're coming out of the gate at least a foot, ideally 18 inches, 2 feet tall when they first leaf out in the spring, they probably wouldn't need much as far as mowing and maintenance in that context. You could have that be the herbaceous layer under them. So, and it looks like the landscape is relatively flat and even.
It is.
So then,
We're on a bit of a knoll, but it does slope to the west just a bit.
yeah.
If you go from the center of the field, but we're fairly flat.
So then having it be, it's not as though it's necessary to do contour work and swale work in order to have trees. Like you basically have a taut canvas that's drawn out there, ready to move up into trees and to start doing what you've articulated of like being in service and creating more corridor for wildlife and places for deer to sleep in the winter, and food for your children and their children and all that kind of stuff. I think starting to really brainstorm on what your budget may look like, both financially, but also time and energy wise to make that happen, and probably of equal value import to my eye just coming into it is what happens to the south and east of you, because that almost certainly is a annual. Well, I mean, it's annual. It's almost certainly hardcore tillage and spray.
Right. Absolutely. And it will probably continue to be that forever.
Yeah.
The farm just sold last year. The farmer passed away.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. And so it was sold. So it already did get sectioned a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
About 40 acres. The southern and western portion of that field that you see got sectioned off, but the rest of it's still maintained together. There's nothing I can really, unfortunately, there's nothing I can really do about it. I would love to buy just the bit there to the east of my property, where there's the little house, and then I would like to just kind of square that up. Now, whether the farmer would do that or not, that's another question.
Yeah.
But that would at least buffer just a bit there to the east. But to the south, I don't think there's anything that I can do about it.
Have you experienced at all? I don't see in the vegetation. I mean, this is just a random snapshot photo, but I don't see any drift from herbicides that affected your.
I haven't had any issues. I know a neighbor had in the past. They also have had big gardens and sold a bit of produce, and they had a loss. They were telling me they had a loss one time. Their strawberry crop, they had some drift, so they lost all of their strawberries. They were compensated by the farmer, but that you just lose years on that too.
Right. Yeah.
Typically what I do is just make sure that I'm out and busy along the fence line when I know that they're going to be spraying.
Yeah.
And they tend to leave that alone. The other thing that I do have, I don't know if you noticed on the map, I have a small aviary as well behind the large building there.
Okay. Let me come back. Yeah.
That's okay. It's just the orange box there, just as a representative of some beehives. And so I have those registered, and they're not supposed to spray near them as well.
I see. There we are. Yeah, right.
So as they're spraying, they do turn that off along the edge of my property.
Yeah, that's intense.
It's just part of living in
Iowa. Yeah. Well, it's part of living everywhere. Is that we're, to a much less raw extent, the Trumansburg property, our 6-acre property, we've got an orchard to the west of us, which is upwind and up watershed, that sprays their apple trees. But I've laid in a very intense. It's not enough to do it at 100%, but plants can really help absorb a lot of the BS that these farmers are using, and it's amazing because it's like at the same part it's absolutely crushingly infuriating. And
Right.
I hear you describe what you're dealing with, and I'm like, yeah, that sounds about what I hear. Like so many so many different contexts where people are trying to grow food for their children, and they're right up against a monolith of poison, basically.
Yep.
And you try to like map it out in your mind so you don't get too frustrated by it. Um,
Right.
there might be value. You never know until you try. Like if you can come at it, and it could have a little wrapper of a white lie in it to like speak with the farmers that are still doing the tilling and spraying to the south and adjacent. Luckily, it seems like I would guess the predominant winds come from the west there, come from the northwest. So you have like spray drift probably is a little bit less just from the context of where you are. But
Yes.
what does it look like to pop by that neighbor at some point and just explain like, hey, my kids have asthma, or I have this breathing condition. Would there be any possibility, like, here's an idea. What if you were to promise to purchase, like if they were to set, for example, 10 acres or 15 acres that's close to your home to an alfalfa in some layout that's convenient for them to do it,
Hmm.
that you would buy those round bales or work
Sure.
out some trade, like some sort of compensation that it would incentivize them to move over to a no spray or a minimal spray context right adjacent to your land.
Right.
Because those bales, if they're not sprayed, would be incredibly useful for building your food forest. So, um,
Definitely.
what could that look like? And at the same time, thinking through if there ever was a call for a massive living wall, it's your southern boundary
South wall.
and yeah, and the southeast boundary underneath those power lines there. Like that,
Yeah.
some serious, miscanthus and poplars and locust
Yes.
and everybody.
I think so too. I was gonna. That was one question I wanted to ask you. What would be good candidates? I know miscanthus would be. I have that planted on the north end of the property there,
Hmm.
northeast.
Okay.
I have a row, maybe 140, 150 feet. Um, and now that that's been in for a year, I'll obviously start being able to harvest from that and move some of them.
Yeah.
Um, what are other good candidates for the power lines? Just given that I need something that can only go, 20 feet.
Sure.
It'd be
Um,
nice to have a visual barrier as well as like you were talking about, just with everything else as far as farming.
right. So to answer that question, yeah, we keep in mind a couple variables all at once. So it has to top out at, you can set something in motion that you have to prune to keep under 20 feet, but why design from scratch something that requires that? So under 20 feet, visual barrier, good windbreak, and because of proximity to the toxicity from that
Yeah.
field and
Right.
driveway, what is it, there's less desire for eating. The miscanthus right out of the gate, 100% is the first order of business. And you've got them planted, so you have your own nursery. Um, they're a little bit hard to divide. I made some videos in the past showing how we do it, but it's a widely enough used plant that there are lots of good resources on how to propagate and plant. The key with them is you want to dig them up, do your divisions and planting in the spring as the soil is starting to warm. They're unique in that way. Um, I think miscanthus as the very leading element, like whatever the absolute closest to the edge of your property line on the east and again on the south, I don't think you can overdo it because then you've got the fibrous root systems. If they're cut by machinery, like however they're spreading out into the field, if they're cut, they're really adaptable to handling that. If there's some spray drift and they get burnt back, then their body parts remain and they might send up new shoots. So you've got like this, and all the leaves and debris create a really good fungal supporting network, which is truly the fungal life is what's going to help detoxify and break down.
Sure.
So that's the leading edge in that defense game, I think. Um, I think there's value.
When
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. When propagating them, I know you said in the spring. Is it okay to do it once the little shoots pop up, or do you want to wait a bit before that?
Yeah, I think the sweet spot. So a couple fun things. Miscanthus is one of the like physically more remarkable, hard to propagate plants. When you see the shoots coming up, they are then fragile enough that yes, you can transplant them, but you almost certainly are going to be breaking roots or breaking tips as you grow. So in our climate, those new shoots emerge around mid-May, later May.
Right.
I like to try to get out, so as soon as we start getting a good thaw and the sun energy is warming up, let's say it's the first week of April, second week of April, I like to get in with a good nursery spade and lift a clump. If you can wash them with a good jet of water. Um, you want to wear gloves. They're very sharp and they can cut really easily, especially the new leading growth tips. They're like little red razor blades. It's ridiculous. Um, but you can get in there, you can divide them quite a bit, and like a clump this big, you could split it into four nice size clumps. You could also split it into 250 little rootlets.
Right.
And with your context, with full sun, a little bit of mulch, maybe you ask that farmer who's got the alfalfa round bales that they're doing, can they leave one or two round bales somewhere near the southern and eastern? Maybe each round bale that they make that's on the eastern boundary of that field, they leave so that you have a source of mulch really easy that you can roll over there. Um,
Sure.
get them in, get them so they start growing, and then get them mulched in between. You shouldn't have to mow or weed. You've seen that. Like once they get going, they don't really need anything.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm excited for that to continue to where I put it in. In portions of it, it did really well. In portions of it, it's pretty bare. So I was looking to fill in the bare spots, and then that's a. I'm excited for that. It looks pretty in the fall. But it's a nice visual barrier for the neighbor's
yeah.
property when I pull in my driveway too.
Yep. And there's just so many layers of value. Like in the future, when you go to cut them down late winter, early spring, because every year you want to cut them down anyway. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so when I'm looking at this map and I see miscanthus on the northeast, when you cut those dead stalks, it's a very short commute by hand to carrying them over and laying them around the pink lady apple, your Cortland, your like
Sure.
that the apricots. Like it's a very great coarse carbon mulch that lays in these long 12-foot lines. So it can be an amazing, simple mulch to drop over. And each year you're just going to get more and more, like every stem begets five more stems if you're keeping up with them.
It's
Um,
amazing. Yeah.
so miscanthus is primary element. I imagine with your full sun there, and you may want to be looking into some nitrogen fixers just on the inside of that miscanthus planting. So just to the west of them along the driveway, just to the north of them along the south line. And could those be? I mean, you could go with the tree form. You could think about black locust. Um, they're a little they're a little more unruly. They'll sucker and spread over time, but that might be fun if you want firewood and you want that browse for bees. If you want something a little bit more manageable, I think river locust, Amorpha fruticosa, could be a gorgeous, it's a non-human food, so it's good browse for your bees, and it's a shrub form, and you can chop and drop and use them as a mulch as needed. And they'll work in between the miscanthus in a nice way.
Okay.
I imagine, depending on the moisture levels, I think poplar could be an amazing taller tree element, and they've got huge broad leaves, so they'll slow breeze down. And if there were a random spray mishap, at least something up there. The miscanthus is only going to get 12 feet, and so poplar, if you let them get 15, 20 feet on the southern line, maybe they're not right under the power lines, but they could be part of your design on the southern line.
Right.
They could be chopped as needed. Once they start, I see your trees of your grape orchard there in the southeast, you might need to
Yep.
cut the poplars more frequently because they're shading out the grapes, but then you've got mulch for your grapes.
Right.
Um,
Sure.
and same thing, the willows, and you could do the same experiments with elderberries. and just say, well, whatever elderberries are growing under the power lines next to that field, they're not for the kids, they're not for us, they're for the bees, they're for whatever birds come through. And they can be right next to the miscanthus because you've got so much light available. I mean, you're not gonna
not gonna have anything blocking it
right,
in the
right.
future.
And even yeah, and even the miscanthus, when they're absolute full size, that amount of shade is not going to hold an elderberry back because they've got infinite on the west. I think, yeah, miscanthus being key, and then you know, the encouragement is thinking about a shrub layer nitrogen fixer as frequently as budget and time allows, and then easy to propagate by cuttings, tree layer on the south end and shrub layer on the east side there. With the ideal goal, if you can set the intention that in any given planting space you're thinking about 4 or 5 species together, then 2 or 3 can get knocked out, and at least you still have somebody there as a skeleton to build more body back out again.
Right.
But yeah, that seems like the work. And whatever you can't do this upcoming season, perennial wise, because you're not going to have enough miscanthus to do every last inch of it, what does it look like to sow out some Sudan grass or some sun hemp or amaranth, or in other words, full sun, very fast, very large annual biomass crops that they provide, you know, bees, and you get the idea. Like, not for you, but just basically getting biomass that's going to get at least 6 feet, ideally closer to 10 or 12, and that can just be laid down in the fall and have cuttings put in through them once they senesce after a growing season. But you've got such a growing season there with that amount of heat and sun. That's who's annual and big. Maybe sunflowers, you know, that kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that was one thing we had talked about putting in was just a field of sunflowers. That's something too. Even that bit of field up in the near the timber there where I planted the persimmon that I got from you. Thought about just in the spring when that's, you know, good and dry, just burning that off and planting sunflowers into it. Would look nice, and then it would give a ton of food for birds and deer and, you know, turkeys and everything.
Well, and for you too.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing with that alfalfa field, the trees for sure, but then also, I mean, there could even be value in asking that farmer, the farmer who's harvesting the alfalfa from your field, who's not spraying, you know, is it a huge lift for them to come through with a tractor and not to till it, but to drill in early in the season? Could they drill in sunflower seed, like just do an acre or two of black oil sunflower, and you know, if it's mowed off pretty tight in the fall and it's round bales, and he takes those bales in the winter, and so it's kind of short. The sunflowers might have a chance. And what is, maybe he's got some suggestions. Maybe there's varieties of corn, not like GMO dent corn, but maybe there's an older flint corn or heritage corns or popcorns that might be able to go in there, that he might be able to facilitate tucking those in to the standing alfalfa. And it'll look weedy in the summer, but the alfalfa and the grain variety of whoever you plant, the oil or grain bearing, might be able to compete with each other in a way that's actually positive.
Sure. That sounds great. One other thing I just thought of when I was looking at this, a lot of the trees that you could see in what I call my timber, but there's not that much tree growth there. A lot of those are ash, unfortunately, and I'm going to lose a lot of them.
Yeah.
So just wanting to plan ahead for that too. So eventually, you know, I'll leave some of them, but some of them I'll have to take down with the chainsaw, just for safety. But you know, what's the next life of that look like is something that I want to plan around sooner rather than later. If I'm going to start taking some of those trees now it's going to open up a lot of light. What do I want to look at as far as planting in there for? I would love it to be. Right now we have some oaks, and I would love to plant some hickory and some, more hardwoods, but also have some of that shrub layer below. Right now the shrub layer consists of honeysuckle.
Yeah.
Mostly.
Yeah.
Mostly because we don't actively manage for that. I don't spray other than cutting them.
Right.
So
Okay.
that's what my shrub layer looks like.
Yeah. So one thing I would note, I made a video. I can look it up and link it to you, but it's also pretty easy to find. It's I made a video where I talked about we're dealing with a very similar picture as are huge numbers of people, probably people on millions and millions of acres across the U.S. Of an ash dominant overstory that is in rapid decline and thinking through strategies of next succession. And I'll just share with you, take it with a grain of salt, but I personally have not found it to be necessary that if an ash is dying or has died, that I need to cut them down in order to figure out who's next in that landscape. Okay. If you have concerns of dead standing ash being unsafe for, like if kids are in there very often or that's leaning over, that's a different story. But cutting them because they're dead, I would personally describe as being a mistake, because that standing tree is habitat for woodpeckers. It is habitat for chickadees and for, and then it'll eventually fall and it'll land where it lands, and then it'll be habitat for chipmunks and everybody else. So you could go in and cut them later if you need to, but for now, in the shrub layer, we found honeysuckle can be swapped out for hazelnut very easily.
Okay.
And when I say swapped out, what I'm not saying is that you need to like go in with a bulldozer and rip out the honeysuckle and make a crater. I literally will take a honeysuckle, cut them flush to ground, put in a hazelnut or two around them, and then just plan maybe twice that first growing season to come back with loppers after a good rain and cut the honeysuckle again flush to ground and lay that green foliage right around the hazelnuts. Maybe you need to do it again one year later, but the whole root system of the honeysuckle stays in place. Their tops, as they rebound, are used as a chop and drop mulch, and then as the root system dies, it feeds the hazelnuts. And that same pattern can be appropriate as you get into sunnier glades to think about elderberry in that way. I've used autumn olive extensively as a way to bring nutrients back in through the shrub layer. If you get Goumi worked out in a good way, that could be an amazing shrub layer nitrogen fixer. Your honeyberries, you've got your Russian varietal honeyberries down by your home orchard space. If you're stool layering them and they're successful in rooting and you've got enough plants to experiment, you could take some of those honeyberry cuttings and put them in. They are Lanacera family. They're the same as the Japanese honeysuckle. And so you could swap out honeyberry for honeysuckle.
Okay.
American persimmon has been incredibly adept at being able to be planted under existing fully alive white ash, and then as the ash declines, they fill out the canopy. And I've got pockets all over the place at our 6-acre spot where I just planted American persimmon. They suffered or whatever, they struggled in the shade, but then made it up, and then the ash died, and now they're just incredibly productive. And then the ash will fall. Maybe they'll crush a persimmon in the winter, and then it'll either stump sprout or it'll sucker and fill out. Pawpaws have worked for us in that context. And then where you've got more sun, like on the southern edge of, I see some of these glades of ash where you've got mowed pathways.
Yeah.
Those southern glades, that's where you can start thinking about your hickory, more oaks, maybe some chestnuts in there with some protection from deer. In fact, as you cut your honeysuckle to plant out the shrub layer, the branches of those honeysuckles could be what you drop around your chestnuts and your hickories to protect them. Bitter nuts, there's, just so many different members in that family. Maybe you want to try some English walnuts to get the juglans in there, but with a little less, juglone to hurt other plants. Butternuts, that whole thing. So in other words, a million options, and the encouragement is that I personally have not seen it be a required prerequisite to cut and clear the ash before getting on with it. And you just think about the more shade-tolerant persimmon and pawpaw, hazelnut in and amongst the ash, and then to the south of the ash, the more light-loving plants. And they can just get, you see it all the time where like there's one canopy in a woods that's starting to die off. It's not like everybody waits. They just start growing slowly underneath and then they pop. So it'll all work out. And then what might be aesthetically, rough on the eye of seeing all these skeletons standing is exquisitely exciting to the woodpeckers for the short run, and then the owls and the hawks and everybody else for the long run.
Yeah, I'm not excited about just clearing it out. That was never my plan. Selectively, I'm going to take some that would be, maybe a danger to, those mode paths that are in there that's for my for other four-wheelers and dirt bikes and things like that.
Yeah.
But that was never my plan to kind of clear that out. There's a lot of other trees. I have, hackberry and cherry and oak and things like that in there.
Mm-hmm.
So I would love to leave some of that habitat for wildlife.
Mm-hmm.
But some of them that are going to be a danger, I want to take out and just use for firewood before they get too punky or anything like that.
Sure. Yeah.
I know there's a tighter window with ash compared to other ones, to leave standing dead. They rot pretty quickly. So.
Yeah, right. There's an intersection there that you can find between the pure wild do nothing, which has value, and manicure every last one, which has its own value that's ascribed by the person. And you're describing something in between that, like, yeah, if you see, especially if there's kids on vehicles where if they were to go off a pathway and hit, like, God forbid, like can't pop into a tree or something happens, like percussive forces against a dead tree, that's something to be aware of. But when in doubt, the good news is just leave. If it doesn't impede anybody's access or safety, just leave them and the birds will love you for it. And know that trees where, even if they're completely alive and super happy now, if they die, you can have 3 different trees growing next to them. If they live, you can still have 3 different trees growing next to them. So then it's just a matter of whatever the, to my eye, highest priority for the foreseeable future is really thinking about the defense, so to speak, against the annual fields to the east and south. And then as propagation and time and energy allows, budget allows, to be peppering in all these different trees in and amongst the ash, acknowledging that succession's happening right around you, and you're an agent to that.
Yeah. I know that you've been working on your Trumansburg property for a decade or longer. Obviously, I want to get this going as quick as possible with talking to you about succession there on my own property.
Mm-hmm.
Where were you able to procure all of your plant material? That's one of the hurdles, without spending, $10,000-$20,000
Right.
on plant material.
Right.
Is it just something that you have to do over time, or what's a good strategy there?
Well, we're a nursery, so we can afford to buy plants from us for free. So, part of becoming a nursery was driven by that exact question of like, hey, I'd like to plant so many things. I don't have unlimited money. I need to start propagating. And so you've got your own, to some extent, your own genetic reservoir there of the different elders, the willows, the honeyberry, the Goumi, and that's why it's good that you're asking the question, like, how do I propagate the Goumi? How am I getting copies of these plants? Because there you go, like the marge, the elderberry, like those going in 2021, you're a year out before you can really get cuttings from them. So one way, avoiding the default of like just buy them retail is, what does it look like to seek out so that's predominantly annual farming around you? Is there a farmer's market where you can go and get fresh veggies during the growing season?
We do have
Okay.
small farmers markets.
So it begins, in my mind, with a cold call systematically to each of those farms of, hey, do you folks sell any fruits or nuts? Do you have currants? Do you have hazelnuts? Do you have blah, blah, et cetera, et cetera? If so, do you ever have extra? So for example, if there's a farm that you can find that, seasonally has fresh hazelnuts for sale that they grow in this area, buy $40 worth of this year's hazelnuts. There's your seed for probably 300 or 400 hazelnut bushes for 30 or 40 bucks. And they're regionally appropriate because they're clearly grown around you, and you're supporting a local person. If they happen to have currants that they sell during the growing season, can you volunteer to help them prune in the late winter and get a ton of cuttings that you can put in a nursery bed, or straight up buy them if that's what's more helpful to them? You get the idea here.
Sure.
And if they don't have those things, do they have any recommendations? Do they know someone with a minor fruit orchard, or do they know of a place where there's nuts growing? Maybe there's some wild spaces. By us, there's Cornell University, and they've got a huge arboretum. We're lucky to have this like huge collection of nuts and fruits with labels. So we do the squirrel thing in the fall, and we go and harvest like the squirrels and get tons of seeds that way. Maybe taking hikes. There are wooded areas. There's Black Hawk Wildlife Area just a few miles away from you.
Right.
These different parks. What are there? It's a little late now, but at least going through and identifying, are there hickories and black walnuts, and that whole scene. Catfish farm. Yeah, really, it's just basically scrolling around. I just spend a lot of time on Google Maps trying to map out who's nearby, that can be the start of some interesting questions to get resources.
And
Yeah.
typically, I know for a lot of those hardwoods, is that how you would just go about it? Mostly just nut harvest and plant the seed directly, or I know you do air prune beds, you do other kind of beds. What would be a good strategy for me? Would it be direct seeding, or would you make it first?
Yeah, so this is where it gets maybe challenging or interesting. I don't think I have a definitive answer. Like, this is the way to do it. If there was one answer that's a more blurred out answer, but I think it is appropriate, is to try to do a bunch of different things, cast a wide net. So this winter, ASAP, on our website, there's a resources page with permaculture nurseries, and there's a whole lot. I mean, we sell plants, obviously, and you can get more from us. That's great. But there are other nurseries out there. And so see what they have. You may want to be investing in a few $100s in good foot tall to 2 foot tall seedling trees that are a year ahead or 2 years ahead, that you're planting, you're protecting, you're mapping, and thinking of them as your future genetic reservoir. That's where you put the bulk of your money, I think, is like a Noah's Ark style, like a couple each of as much diversity as possible of plants that are ideally ungrafted, that can be propagated readily by seed and cuttings or divisions. At the same time, asking those nurseries, hey, do you ever sell seed of this? So you can get good improved cultivars from Twisted Tree Nursery or Perfect Circle. It's 50 cents a pop, but it gets you 20 or 30 really amazing hazelnuts or really great, good blight-resistant chestnuts. And of those, some can go in an air prune box if you have the time to build. Some go in a nice nursery bed. Where you are there, you're not going to have tons of chipmunk and squirrel and rabbit and deer pressure. It's just not, it's a little bit of a desert for that.
Right.
So you get a little bit of leeway, a little latitude in trying to grow those from seed without a huge amount of protection, whereas we don't. And so then you've got some plants that are already established and going, a little expensive, but get the ball rolling. Good cultivar seeds from folks that are known and stratified properly. Same thing for pawpaw, persimmon, maybe some apple seeds, pear, all the different things. And then on top of that, making those cold calls to folks in your area. Do you have, for example, maybe there's an orchard nearby that still has drops from the fall of just, maybe it's sprayed, maybe it's not, whatever, but there's just like hundreds of pounds of rotting apples, rotting pear, peaches. Hey, do you mind if I come through and just scoop most of them wouldn't even care, like whatever you want, I don't care. You can say it, you could say it's for feeding pigs, if whatever you need to do, but there's seed stock that can be grown out that as those seedlings grow, you could then graft your pink lady and your Cortlands onto those, your pears onto those, or simply just grow them, which would be my pathway of just grow them as seedlings, see what the fruit tastes like. Chances are you'll love it. If you don't, you can then graft onto trees that are way above deer browse at that point.
Right.
And that's $0. In your ash grove, in the areas you're trying to reforest, if you can find good inexpensive caches of hazel and chestnut walnut, you may be doing very well with excess seed of those to simply go in with a shovel, open the soil a little bit, and slip 2 or 3 seeds in, and either drop a flag there, or what I like to do is simply slip in a garlic clove or 2, because the garlic comes up really early and it flags it for me. If I see random cultivar garlic coming up in an ash grove, I'm like, somebody else is coming right after that. I forget who. It might be a peach, might be a persimmon, but I'm going to weed around it until I see a tree come up.
Okay.
And that's a very low cost way. That's like a minute per tree planting, maybe $1 if you've bought the seeds.
Okay.
So just a bunch of different pathways that I think, again, you find your intersection of what's your hurry, and I think it makes sense. Like time is of the essence to move along with this. So put the bulk of it towards the known trees, then the cultivar, then the local wild, and are there ditches around you where you can identify elderberry and willow that's already growing? There's unlimited cuttings to be had from those, and they get cut down by brush hogs every season anyway. So who do you need to ask? Do you ask permission, or do you just pre-brush hog it but carefully?
For those I don't. Usually I'll just drive up and take what a few cuttings, and no, you don't even see it. Obviously.
Yeah, right.
Right.
And so if you hit it from all those angles at once, you're bulked out more on time and diversity, but there's a lot more resilience in there, and you're supporting some good nurseries, and you're making connections with folks locally, and yeah, there's just like a many pronged strategy that is in line with how we operate and have done so for the last 15 years or so, as I weighted strongly towards finding things for free so I can afford to go wild with it, but then also valuing, like, yeah, I'll spend a couple $100 a season to get in. I'm not going to find Carmine Goumi growing in a ditch, but once I have it, I can get them growing in a ditch wherever I want, in 2 or 3 years.
And that's what I feel like I've done so far. Most of, as you look at the map, you'll see most everything is named cultivar. But I'm to the point now where I just want a lot of bulk material, a lot of bulk plants, just to fill in some of that now. I did, when we first bought the property, our state does a bit of a cost share on tree. There's a state nursery.
Yeah.
There's some programs there. I did qualify for that, but I didn't go through with it. Mostly because then they have a restriction on what you can do with a lot of those. So, you can't touch them for 20 years or whatever. If they pay for part of them. I guess the approach that I'd kind of rather go with is similar to what you're doing. Is just planting it out and observing and seeing what happens.
Yeah.
If something doesn't work out, then I'm okay with either deer eating it off or cutting it down and letting the next succession come through. That's where I want my strategy to be. I guess is just to have that continuous now.
Yep.
at this point.
Yeah, I think as you're sharing that, a side thought that came to my mind, and I pulled it up here, is if you go online and you search, the first place I would go, because I've had personally good success with it, but you can scale this out to work with any option, is I search for Missouri Conservation District tree sale, and I think, you're midwinter here. There's probably still a good chance of having this work out for you. Um, but you could swap out Missouri for Iowa. You could swap it out for Indiana, for Ohio. Anybody within like 5 states in any direction,
Hmm.
um, it's reasonable. And the reason I'm drawing your attention to this is these are conservation tree sale agencies that when you buy 100 trees at a time may be as low as 30 cents, 50
Right.
cents, 18 cents. Like Kentucky, I bought trees from Kentucky Conservation District tree sales. I think they were 17 cents a piece when I bought 200 at a time. And so then the risks are very low. It gets you a year ahead on things. You can plant them out, especially for your nitrogen fixers, your early succession trees. Um, and what's lovely is, yeah, a lot of them are about native species. That's wonderful. And also, I'm seeing here elderberry, false indigo, hawthorn, hazelnut, and these are pawpaw. Um, these are all plants that have many, many layers of value in the landscape beyond, exclusively native for native's sake. It's like there's food and medicine, and there's biomass and nitrogen fixing, and all the different layers. So, sooner than later, putting in some effort, X state conservation district tree sale and see what's going on there. And maybe $300 in that investment might get you 1,000 trees for both your home site and the remote site. That as long as you're not like getting them from Georgia or South Carolina, like for us, Missouri's pushing it. And when I've purchased mulberry and persimmon and pawpaw from those sorts of much warmer nurseries, they never survive our winters. So you want somebody that's like a zone 3, zone 4 hardy plant, so it doesn't matter where you're getting them from.
Right. Right. Okay. Yeah. As you were talking about that, I think I was saving. I think the cost share was maybe half or whatever. But the biggest thing that turned me off on it was, that the requirements that they had to go through with it was spray in the fall before you're going to plant.
Oh, really?
Um, then you would come through and plant, and then spray again in the spring. Like,
Huh.
and either you needed to do that and show them that you did it, or
Really?
yeah, you had to have it planted by someone.
Oof. So conservation plantings brought to you by Monsanto, basically.
Right, exactly.
That's
To
gross.
get rid of that herbaceous layer first, that was what they were concerned with,
Yeah.
and then it was more, you know, I had a timber person come out, and it was more just lines of trees, here instead of what you're talking about as far as guilds, is what I'm more interested in is planting some of those plants together,
Mm-hmm.
and that wasn't in what the plan was.
Yeah. I that I mean that's ridiculous that they have those sorts that you have to use poison in order to engage with them is just grotesque and really
Right.
telling. Um, I never have seen that with these. Yeah, there are some states that they have. Um, yeah, like I'm looking at Missouri. Their preference is to support Missouri residents, but it's open to anyone. There are some where it's like you can't order unless you're from that state. I think
Right.
like New Jersey might have had that. I forget now, but um, if you poke around, you'll find. I've ordered from a number of these in the past, and again, as long as they're like rock solid hardy, they're not marginally hardy to you, and from a warmer. But you might also want to look at like what does Minnesota have, and
Yeah.
do the Dakotas have something that you can get. But this is a really great source of just like broad genetic representation that for the price is incredibly reasonable when you're ready to plant at scale.
Okay. Yeah,
Um,
that's good. I mean, definitely had thought of that as far as Iowa, but I hadn't thought of it as far as other states. I know Iowa State University does have a nice, um, nursery there that they sell from,
Hmm.
and it's reasonable, like you said, under $1 a tree.
Yeah. It's
So
it's a ridiculous. I mean, it's definitely they are being subsidized, and of all the agricultural things to subsidize, having tree production so that people can reforest with diverse woody perennials, it's like, yeah, that's fine by me.
yeah,
Who knows? I'm sure there's spraying. I'm sure there's fertilizer, like all those things that I wouldn't love. But if it means that a few million or hundreds of millions of new trees come into the world each year that can be planted and then not sprayed or tilled in the future, then it's like the least harm for sure.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
definitely.
cool. Well, are there other? It feels like we touched on a whole lot this morning. Are there other areas that you were hoping we could make sure we cover, or does this feel like a good place for today?
I think it feels like a good spot. Excuse me. Um, I have a lot to think about now. Um, Obviously, I've been trying to think about it, leading up to this and in the previous years, just watching your channel. Um, you know, that's pretty much what I would like to do here. What you've
Mm-hmm.
done at Trinkenberg. Excuse me. So just trying to get to that scale.